Thank you for joining us for this morning's discussion. We are thrilled that you could join us this morning for what is sure to be a great conversation on some of the major federal investments in technology, education, and workforce development. These are all critical areas of policy for building an equitable future for all Americans. And with the new year almost here, we're excited to take a look at how things are shaping up in that respect. The passage of a historic $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has solidified some of what we're going to be talking about this morning, today in both policy, but there's so much that is still kind of unsure at this point in terms of these policies and how they'll be implemented in a smart and equitable way. And as of this conversation, the Build Back Better Act is still being negotiated in Congress. So some of today's discussion will center on the potential of specific provisions as we look to 2022 and beyond. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to leave a bit of time during each panel to answer your questions. So right after we finish each of the panels, you'll have an opportunity. So look for that. If you want to put some of those in the chat or via the question button, feel free to do so. Without further ado, we're now going to welcome our first panel on education policy. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues, my fantastic colleagues, and I'm going to ask Laura, Amy, and Elena to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Laura, if you'll go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Laura Bornfriend, and I'm Director of the Early and Elementary Education Policy Program. Happy to be here.
And Elena.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Autumn. My name is Elena Silva. I'm the director of the Pre-K-12 education team here at New America.
Thank you. And Amy.
There, I'm Amy Lightnin, director of the higher ed program at New America. Glad everyone can be here.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Laura, I want to begin with you. On the surface, the Build Back Better Act seems poised to revolutionize early childhood education in the US. Can you talk us through the details a little bit and give us a sense of early ed and childhood investments in the bill?
Sure. So this is really a once in a generation opportunity. And should this bill pass in its current form, it really has the potential to transform early childhood education, both childcare and pre-K. And there's two pieces in the early childhood education space. And so I'll talk just briefly about the childcare side, and then I'll jump into the universal pre-K. So on the childcare, it would make families earning up to 250% of the state median income over a period of years would become eligible to receive subsidized care. In addition to income, qualifying parents or guardians would be required to be participating in an eligible activity, but the list is very broad and would cover just about every income eligible caregiver. A big change from how states currently do childcare through childcare subsidies through the federal Child Care and Development Block Grant, that those payments to childcare providers are determined typically by market rate studies. But with Build Back Better, it would require states to establish new payment rates based on cost estimation models. So cost estimation models that actually include the quality of providing what it would take to provide high quality care, and presuming a living wage for childcare staff. That would include pay parity with elementary school teachers who have similar credentials. And so there would be overall higher payment rates to participating providers, and higher quality, presumably, for families, and still include a variety of options, including childcare centers and family childcare home providers. On the pre-K side, it's a federal state partnership and really meant to build on the many states, almost nearly all states, all but 6, build on their existing pre-K programs. Most states currently only provide pre-K for 4-year-olds. So I think one of the biggest moves would also include 3-year-olds. So it would be building towards universal entitlement for all 3 and 4-year-olds. It's a 6-year, program, with the first 3 years being primarily a planning phase for states. So states would submit plans for planning grants, and then after that, the second 3 years would really be full implementation. There's a lot of different, requirements included that states, especially on the quality side, would need to ramp up in some areas. And both of these states opt in. So they're not required to participate, but they would opt in to accept the funds.
So it's interesting, you've talked a little bit about what this means in terms of the state and local level, but I'm curious, are there any particulars in terms of what this means for the providers at the state and local level and how they would implement that? Are there any additions that you would add there?
Yeah, I would just say that, so on the childcare side, eligible providers would need to participate in the state's quality rating system. And so states will have to have a quality rating system in place. Now, most states do have this, but there is a lot of, there could be a lot of attention on quality and building quality and making sure that all families and children have access to high quality. So some providers will need to make changes around, the kind of environment and things that they're providing for families, as well as increase compensation. And they will get the funds from the states to be able to provide that living wage. So it's not, it won't be additional cost to families. It will be payments from the state that will be, including those. I think one of the, on the pre-K side, I think something I didn't note before, but, is something important to include. It's the program would be intended to provide pre-K through a mixed delivery system. So elementary schools can participate, but so can childcare centers, and so can family childcare providers. And so for those centers and home providers that opt into pre-K, they would be required to follow the state standards around pre-K and serve 3 and 4-year-olds, and pay salaries equivalent for the lead teachers in those classrooms to elementary school teachers with if those childcare center teachers have similar credentials. And so overall, there will need to be some investments in higher education at the state level, because at pre-K there are requirements for teachers over a period of 6 years to obtain additional education and training.
Super helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Sure. I wanted to move to you, Elena, and ask you a little bit about what you feel some of the most significant elements of the Build Back Better bill are as it relates to elementary and secondary education.
Sure, thanks. So first I'll back up to Laura's comments because they're related. It overlaps significantly. And just to put a point on that, it's a really significant deal. It's a big deal that we would extend the traditional domain of public school to pre-K. It's something that's been in the works for states, for a while now, but to do that at a free, universal, national level, to provide that opportunity is a really big deal. Laura and her team have been doing, research and documenting this for a long time. So that's a great opportunity for us to try to inform that. It's also, of course, related because it's the connection, it's this transition from early care and early learning into this, what we consider the school space, elementary education. So the investment in pre-K is, we could look down the line and see, for example, the outcomes of students. We know that there's plenty of research on this, children that have access to high quality early education and children that don't. We know that there's big differences in outcomes. And so I mentioned that just because this investment in pre-K is not just an investment in young children, it's an investment in the whole system to make the whole system more equitable and to make sure that we have more equitable outcomes all the way through up into higher education and beyond. So I think that's worth noting. Another really big significant investment that we see in Build Back Better is in the educator workforce. This is another big play for equity and quality in our public education system. We have, I think as a field, we've strayed from these talking points over the past 10 years or so, but if you were to dial back 10 years, you would hear only about how teachers are the most important, in-school factor for student achievement or for student outcomes. While we don't, that we're not really saying that as much anymore, it is true. And there's a tremendous amount of research to show that educators are among the most important influences in children's development and learning. And so we know that teachers are also really inequitably distributed across schools, across districts. So you have your least experienced teachers working with students that need the most, and vice versa, your most novice teachers working with the students who need the most support. That problem, of course, has been around for a long time, and we've been trying to solve it in a number of ways. Also trying to solve what we know to be both acute and broad shortages, teacher shortages. Pretty much in every state, everywhere you go, you're going to see some sort of shortage. And we know nationally that we have a big mismatch racially, ethnically, linguistically between our teachers and our student population. So we've been doing a lot of work to try to address those issues through both improving educator preparation policy and through working directly with the field through our Grow Your Own network. We have programs that we're working with in 12 different states. So we're thrilled that Build Back Better includes funding specifically for Grow Your Own educator programs. That's $112 million that's through 2025. $112 million is an important number. It's about to show up again. Separate from that, there's $112 million. Roughly, it's a little tiny bit more for competitive grants for teacher residency programs, which share the principle with GYO. There's some overlap there of clinical experience as a key part of educator development. So this is really important for us. We know that this clinical experience piece is important for teacher development, and we see it both in Grow Your Own and in teacher residency programs, but those are two separate pieces in Build Back Better. Another $112 million for Augustus F. Hawkins. This is important because while it's been authorized, there's never been funding that's actually for Hawkins. So that's $112 million for this another HEA Title II program. This is focused again on improving educator preparation programs, is specifically for HBCUs, tribal colleges, and other minority serving institutions. And then the last thing I'll say is just that there's a lot more to say about this, but I'll stop here with the educator workforce piece because it's just it's a really big chunk. The funds themselves are not that much. If you look across, they're not as significant. But to have so much put forth towards developing our educator workforce is quite significant. It reflects a commitment to something that we think and we're working really hard to promote. There's $160 million as well to support the development of educators to serve students with disabilities, so special educators, and $200 million for grants to support Native American language teachers and educators. So all those things together combined is a lot of focus on developing and improving our educator workforce.
Thanks. That's really exciting to hear how these investments in the workforce, the educator workforce, are kind of coming about. I'm curious because you also talked a little bit about the educators who are working with certain populations, and I know that your team does a lot of work, considerable work with particular student populations, dual language learners, students with disabilities, and the chronically ill. Can you tell us a little bit about what Build Back Better means for those student populations?
Yeah, sure. So we do focus a lot on English learners, have for some time, on emergent bilingual and multilingual students, including the youngest of those learners. And so that again overlaps back to Laura's points about the early learners in pre-K. Those are the fastest growing part of our education systems, the fastest growing demographic. So it's important to note that the free universal pre-K has the potential to increase access and quality for that population in particular. So these are students, young dual language learners that really need strong bilingual dual language education that is promoting the continued development of their home languages while they learn English. That's been our focus, and this does allow for that. There's also the investment in educators, again, is a matters significantly for these populations, because again, the teachers are distributed inequitably, largely by income and race, if you look across it, but also if you look at at the availability of teachers who are well trained to support students with disabilities and English learners, we don't have near the teachers we need. The teacher shortages, if you look across the country, you're going to see those are the places where we have teacher shortages. The origins of our Grow Your Own Educator Network and our Grow Your Own Educator work was research. Was because the problem we would see that there was a huge need for bilingual educators. It was the paraprofessionals, it was the teacher assistants who were the ones communicating and providing the back and forth to families and to students, and they didn't have a pathway to become fully licensed teachers. And so that was the origin of like, all right, well, let's grow them up into become fully licensed teachers. That's just one example. Obviously the Grow Your Own does much more than that now, but what Build Back Better could be. It could be a real movement to improve the educator workforce in ways that meets these teacher shortages, that addresses this mismatch we have in this case, racially, ethnically, linguistically between teachers and students, and in that way really would help those student populations. I will mention also, just on students with disabilities, Build Back Better there's a much bigger pot of money, $150 billion, to increase access to home and community-based services. So while not in the traditional education space, that's a crucial service that supports people with disabilities, including children. So this is Medicaid, but it's related in the sense that these are children that are served at home. They have long-term care, and without those services, if they're not able to stay in their home and get those services in their home, then they really don't have access to the same kind of learning that they would otherwise. There's also, just to go back quickly to the $160 million for the Native American language teachers, back to the English learner work that we do, we've seen and documented in our work language learners that in many indigenous communities, the native languages disappear. Some have language reclamation programs, but largely speaking, this is another big need. And so again, while it's a small pot, those grants would help enable children in certain communities that are really losing their language or at risk of losing their language to reclaim it and to hopefully continue to support their language.
Got it. Super helpful. And I'm going to segue now to Amy. And you kind of set this tone also, Elena, for the connection between it all, right? So now we're moving into higher ed. And Amy, specifically as it relates to Build Back Better, the bill that passed in the House, unfortunately, was significantly pared down from what the Biden administration had originally proposed. Can you tell us about what remains in the current version and some of the things that were cut out?
Sure, but first I want to say what I don't think anybody else has said yet is that Build Back Better is not a done deal yet. Knock on all of the wood, like all of the, there's all the wood here right now. So, okay, so let's hope this happens. So yes, the higher ed funding was absolutely pared down and was profoundly disappointing. But I want to be clear, though, that if I had to choose between some of the higher ed pieces and the early childhood investments, I would have picked early childhood hands down, absolutely. And I'm thrilled about those investments because I think, to echo Laura and Elena, this is such a big deal for all of the reasons that they laid out. I don't think it needed to be a choice, but I'm not going to get into that right now. If it had to be a choice, I think the right choice is made, but it didn't need to be a choice, but hashtag Congress, whatever. But in terms of Build Back Better and higher ed, we saw this continual winnowing from the big promises of the campaign, further winnowed in the American Families Plan, further winnowed in what the House and Labor Committee first proposed, to what ultimately passed in the House and what still awaits in the Senate. But there's still a lot of things in there. Look, I'm not going to sneeze at the fact that there are things for higher ed in there. So I'm going to go through some of them, not all of them. Some highlights. So there was an increase to the Pell Grant of $550. It wasn't the double Pell, but there's an important thing that isn't talked about as much within that, which is that we're not going to now ask students to prove that they're poor multiple times. So if a student, their spouse or their parents, depending on who the student is, received a means tested federal benefit in the last 2 years, Ed has to automatically make them eligible for the maximum Pell Grant. So that's good. The current version of the bill would allow federal financial aid to go to DACA students, which is great. That being said, I think it's pretty vulnerable to the reconciliation process called the bird bath, but we're all watching that and hoping that that sticks. There were $6 billion for minority serving institutions, $3 billion for R&D grants for MSIs, $500 million for retention and completion grants. I'm going to talk in a minute about how that's also a missed opportunity. And the completion grants is something we've really been engaged in. The department is going to be doing a program to scale up evidence-based practices that focus on helping students complete college, because it's not enough just to go to college, obviously. And we've been really involved in the advocacy in both helping to push for the money, bringing stakeholders together to push for the money, to push for priorities within the money, and to talk to the department about implementation. Those are a few things that are in there. There are two really big disappointments for us. I mean, lots of things. Double Pell is, I'm not putting Double Pell on the list because I think there were two pieces that really could and should have been what early ed had in terms of once in a generation opportunity. And the first was free community college. There's some money for community colleges intact, which I think my colleagues will probably talk about. And free community college would be great, but I think the piece in here that was really, I think, novel and important and a huge political lift that I don't know when we're going to get again is the federal state partnership piece. Mm-hmm. So continually the states are pulling out of higher ed. They are just disinvesting, and they're disinvesting, and the federal government keeps like shoveling money in, not in the form of grants to students, but in the form of loans. So as sort of the feds shovel in more money that students have to pay back, the states are sort of creeping out. And we have to stop that dynamic. And a federal state partnership would have done that. And no one was talking about this a few years ago. And our team did a report 5 or 6 years ago, sort of calling for this. And a bunch of, it started to take hold in the presidential campaign. Many of the candidates talked about it, the need for a federal state partnership. It was in the American Families Plan. We were thrilled about that. And it didn't make the cut. So that's a loss. And then the other is around what became this $500 million pot for college completion grants. It was originally proposed as a $62 billion pot, not just for college completion grants, but really to be like a Title I for higher education, to help, not fully make up for, but to try to make up for the real historical inequities in terms of funding different institutions, and institutions that serve large numbers of students of color and low-income students. And this really could have been a game changer, and it didn't happen. And I think if we really want to close the racial equity gap on completion and post-completion outcomes, we need some big investment like that. So we're going to keep pushing, but it didn't make it this round. One thing I do want to talk about briefly that isn't Build Back Better, but other congressional action, and I know Sarah and Josh from OTI are going to talk about this later, and I can't be there for that part of the conversation, but there have been huge investments, both at the end of last year and in the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill, to help subsidize broadband access for low-income college students. And during the pandemic, well, we're still in the pandemic. During the first year of the pandemic, we saw a lot of attention in the press paid to the digital divide, particularly around K-12 students, right? With kids sitting in Taco Bell parking lots trying to get Wi-Fi to do their homework. Super important. Absolutely, attention should have been paid to it, but less attention was paid to the fact that low-income college students, adult students, also suffered from the digital divide, and they were borrowing money to take these classes online that they couldn't access. So, and we commissioned a survey that found that 1 in 5 community college students who stopped out did so because of the lack of technology access or internet access. So one of the most impactful things that we've been a part of, and wouldn't have happened without OTI, who had the Hill relationships around broadband and the know-how on the broadband side, was getting Pell students included in these various bills that actually became law and provided and will provide billions of dollars to help low-income folks, including students of all ages and kind, have access to more affordable, reliable internet. So that's pretty great. So Build Back Better, still some good things, big disappointments, but also some really big wins this year.
So that is a really good explanation of kind of like what's in and what's out. And I really like that you started us off by just realizing that we really do need to kind of be hopeful because it's not a done deal as well. As a follow-up to what you just talked about, the Department of Ed is in the midst of a negotiated rulemaking process. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that, like what that process means and some of its major implications for 2022?
No.
Okay.
2 minutes, Amy.
2 minutes. Okay, the sexy stuff. Okay, thanks, Elena. Sexy stuff is big ticket congressional items, but unsexy implementation matters. This super archaic process that is super boring, very technical, that nobody wants to pay attention to for months and months on end really matters. I'm gonna like hold up. There's this in the Federal Register notice. So for those of you who don't follow, who aren't in the higher ed space, you won't know what this process is. I'm not going to explain it now because now I probably have 1 minute. It's annoying. Nobody else has to do it except for us. But there's this like Federal Register notice where they are talking about considering standards of administrative capability under 34 CFR 668.16. That sounds awful, right? Super boring. Who cares? Everybody should care because this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of baseline consumer protection for our financial aid dollars. So our student, you know, we hear these stories about students who've been harmed by colleges, about colleges that have closed, about students who leave their students with debt and no degree, or, you know, no degree at all. And a part of that is because the department, you know, doesn't really have any standards, like any baseline sort of like the lowest possible baseline standards for what it should expect of schools who are basically able to accept hundreds of billions of dollars in federal financial aid. And this super boring, awful process is where the rubber hits the road. So it matters a lot. If y'all don't want to follow it, I get that. If you do want to follow it, you can, you know, sign up to do, you know, weeks at a net, you know, all day meetings for weeks at a time, or you can follow our Twitter feed for a play-by-play, which is also probably way too in the weeds, or you can like read our blogs about it, which sort of gives you high level, or you can just ignore it like most people do. But we will not be ignoring it. And it's important. So y'all should know what's happening and be glad and grateful that you aren't paying attention to it. How is that, Elena?
We are glad that you are paying attention to it, and we are glad to have the information so that we can all plug in as needed. I have one question that I want to ask all of you, which is just related to what are the opportunities and areas of need for philanthropy to really kind of get involved in implementing these major investments in ed?
So I'll start. I mean, top of mind for me is that states will need capacity to implement these new programs and make the most of these new investments. And I think that there are a number of ways that foundations can be helpful there. The other piece is, you know, states will both need to go slow to really develop like well thought out plans in place, but there's a real need. I mean, families and young children need better quality. They need care and education now. And there'll be a real need to show that, you know, politically, that these dollars are being spent on what they're supposed to and what they need to. And so I think, you know, when I think about philanthropy and, you know, what role they can fill, I think supporting states as they ramp up a process to in the pre-K space, make grants and contracts to local providers. Like this will be sort of a new system in a lot of states that needs to be set up. Also, supporting and providing funding to encourage states to engage stakeholders and expand the voice of whose really experiences are coming into shaping the details of what those programs and look like, and where the dollars are needed, and things like that, like getting real input from families and providers on the ground to head off some of the, what we know are often called, unintended consequences. But if you ask, from the start, you might be able to head those off. I think helping with funding program evaluation and support for the continuous improvement process, funding again to really have an outreach plan for high need communities. It's not going to be enough to just put more build provider capacity or put additional programs in high need communities, but to actually, encourage those families and build trust with families in those communities to come and participate in these programs, and why they're beneficial and why they're, are there to serve, them. Technical assistance, data collection and strengthen data systems. I think, states have data systems, but they need additional really help connecting the dots between both on the early ed to K-12 side, but I would presume, and correct me if I'm wrong, on the K-12 and beyond side, connecting the dots across those data systems. And then I'll also add, and then I'll turn it over, is that supporting efforts to connect and align what's happening, from pre-K into K-12, like connecting those dots around things like assessments and instructional strategies, and all of the ways to make those connections even stronger. So I'll stop there.
Super helpful. If you have anything else to add, feel free to put it into the chat for everyone. Elena, Amy, any kind of quick additions?
Yeah, I'll quickly say, echoing Laura's points about systems alignment, there's a lot that could be done there, and the transition points, there's a lot there as well. The system we have now is chunked out in arbitrary ways. There's no reason why pre-K, like the early learning is here, it starts at this age, and that K-12 somehow runs, or pre-K all to whatever age. That's all sort of made up and arbitrary. And those transition points are really important because we see students fall out all the time because of that. And families too. The other major point I'd make is this connection between schools and communities. We haven't talked about the pandemic at all. This was a problem before. It is like a crisis now, where we need help strengthening this relationship between schools and communities. Schools cannot do it all. We do not have a social safety net right now, and there's not really anywhere else for people to go. So the schools, the public school system is just holding a lot. Connecting community-based services and higher education, for example, institutions with the district. That's just one way that you do that. You see community colleges working with school districts, for example. You see ways that schools are actually connecting with community-based organizations to support whole families and the development of children. That's ultimately what's going to matter most, and particularly right now, I'd say in these years. So I would really look to philanthropy to try to support that.
And I just quickly +1 everything Laura said around implementation, but just around the implementation pieces for higher ed. And then also some case making and some development for ideas for the things that didn't happen this time.
Got it. Well, thank you all so very much appreciate it. And if you have additional thoughts, again, I ask that you feel free to put them in the chat for all of who are the attendees to have a chance to hear additional thoughts you may have. With that, I'd love to transition to a conversation with our workforce development policy. And I would love to ask my fantastic colleagues, Mary Alice, Iris, and Lil to introduce themselves. I will start with Mary Alice, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Alice McCarthy, and I direct the Center on Education and Labor here at New America.
Fantastic. And Iris.
Hi, I'm Iris Palmer, and I'm Deputy Director for Community Colleges at New America.
Awesome.
And hi, everyone. I'm Lil Tesfaye. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the Center on Education and Labor.
Fantastic. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for being willing to kind of share all the things that you've been up to and kind of give us a lot of information that will be so important for how we can really dig into these important investments. I would love to start with Mary Alice. I've read in a number of places that the Build Back Better Act makes historic investments in workforce development, in community colleges and in apprenticeship. Can you tell us a little bit more about the context of this? What makes this so important, especially as it relates to like job quality?
Yeah, thank you, Autumn. Yeah, thanks very much. And it is truly a historic investment. And I'll add Amy's caveat that we're not there yet. So fingers crossed, because this is a historic investment and a historic opportunity. Depending on how you count, we're upwards of $40 billion in investments in workforce development and career and technical education and in apprenticeship, and also in our care workers. And these are all systems and workers in which there's just been chronic underinvestment in the United States. So this is really, as Laura said, it's a once in a generation sort of opportunity here. And I think what's really exciting about it in particular too, and that as we're rounding the corner here out of 2021 and 2022, that's sort of coming into focus, is that we're about to deploy these resources, hopefully, in a very different labor market than we normally deploy new resources in workforce development and community colleges and new investments. Usually when you see sort of, additions to our workforce development sort of spending, it's because we're in a recession and people are having a tough time finding jobs. And the last time we saw a big sort of increase in investments in community college workforce programs and in workforce development was, of course, during the Great Recession. And so it's always great. It's appropriate to have the resources come at that time. But because it's often, those resources are often deployed in a slack labor market, it can be hard to drive some of the priorities that we all share, I think, here around what we want workforce development and apprenticeships and career and technical education to do for our students and workers. So sort of, I think, to some of our surprise, we're not in that situation right now. Our economy looks a lot, our labor market right now looks a lot more like it did in 2019 than it did in 2020. We're back down to 4.2% unemployment, and we are hearing about labor shortages a lot. And that was just not the case the last time we went into a recession. So the reasons for that are complicated, and whether or not this will be sustained is also not known. But that creates a set of labor market conditions that are really great for sort of driving some of the changes that have been hard, that they're hard to do when unemployment is high, or when employers aren't really necessarily, employers aren't feeling sort of these pain points around hiring and retention. So we're really excited about that. It just feels like it's coming at a great time, particularly for the strategies that we have been working on for some time, and that we think are just profoundly important for driving more equity and inclusion in our labor market. And those are strategies like apprenticeship and like expanding and improving the quality of our community college workforce programs. And in particular of making sure that for our workers in the care sector, in early education and childcare and in home care, that they that their wages and benefits reflect the essential nature of the work they're doing. And for the first time, we really may have an opportunity to drive that conversation much more than we have at other times when we have new resources. So we're going to be paying a lot of attention to that. And my colleagues Iris and Lowell will talk in some more specifics about what those opportunities are, but fingers crossed. It also creates some challenges, though, to be having so much funding at a time too, when there's just so much happening and it's not the familiar landscape. So happy to talk about that more later. But this is truly a very, very exciting time.
Okay, thank you for that. If you wouldn't mind, actually, would you go just for a moment into the challenges and what those look like?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think the challenge whenever you're sort of putting lots of money into the system is first of all, for the system to be these different systems. I say the workforce and community college and apprenticeship investments are sort of sprinkled around the federal government. They're going into all sorts of different places. A lot of it's going into the Department of Labor, but as you'll hear from Iris and Lowell, some of it's going to the Department of Ed. There's money going into HHS that will support care workers. There's money going into commerce. So the key, what's going to be challenging is sort of keeping these investments from all just sort of going into their silos and not not being coordinated in any way, or not even being conscious of each other. There's real opportunities here for the federal government to do some like joint guidance around, how these funds should be used across different agencies, and some common language, some common priorities in the grant programs that they put out. But that takes a lot of work, and we'll be thinking a lot about that. But that's a challenge, is it becomes very siloed. And then the other, I would just say the challenge is really seizing this opportunity to make all of these dollars sort of come together around a set of key priorities that really lift the quality of jobs, lift people's wages, lift people's opportunities, and really allow them to, connect the education to really good jobs. But siloing and everything sort of reverting back to normal, or not to normal, but reverting back to the playbook that we always have. It's time for a new narrative and a new set of, it's just time for some new thinking that is in context with the opportunity that this labor market is creating for us to use these resources that way. Probably more than you wanted, but there you go.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was curious about. Appreciate it. And I think you speak to the fact that these could be siloed, but they shouldn't be. And I think that's a good segue to this idea, which I want to ask you about, Iris, which is about, if you could tell us a bit about the investment specifically for community college and those that are related to workforce development, what's new and what's not new? And I think that fits in with this idea of us not going back to the old playbook.
Yeah, thanks, Autumn. You're absolutely right. So just to echo Amy, we were very disappointed that we did not get free college this time around. We hope someday we will, particularly for that state-federal partnership that Amy highlighted. But we are thrilled, or I am definitely thrilled, that there are investments in the capacity for community colleges in this, because it's really needed right now. We've seen enrollments in community colleges drop almost 15% since the fall of 2019. And that's just a lot of missed opportunity and development for people who would have otherwise had access to education. And at the same time, we're seeing those huge disruptions in the labor market that Mary Alice alluded to, particularly that struggle to connect people with high quality jobs, which is actually what's going to bring people back to community colleges. Community colleges know this, but they're really struggling to connect to that and implement to that. And thanks to some people who are probably participating today, we're actually working on building community college capacity to address their enrollment issues, to build educational pathways, both pre-degree and all the way up to the bachelor's degree, to connect to high quality jobs in the labor market. But to actually scale those types of interventions and things that we're working on, we do need a large federal investment in community college capacity. And the Build Back Better legislation has that included. So fingers crossed it passes. So it has about $6.1 billion across 2 programs for community colleges. One is the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Program, which is we call the TACT grants, which was actually a large investment that happened during the Great Recession in the Obama administration, and is being plussed up with additional funding. The other one is a new program called Community College Industry Partnership Grant Program that's at the Department of Education. And this is really exciting because we've done a lot of research on the $2 billion TACT investment that the Obama administration did. We actually looked at the 216 final evaluations of all the grants that happened in that particular program. And we found that the participants were nearly twice as likely to complete a program and about 30% more likely to have some kind of wage or job benefit from the program. So we know that this type of investment can be really effective, which is why it's so exciting to see it get additional funds in Build Back Better. We also came up with a set of recommendations about how the federal government might think about having a better program to build up community college capacity. And we're actually excited to see that some of those recommendations have been put into legislation for Build Back Better. So for instance, we recommended that a percentage of the funding be set aside for student support services, which were particularly effective in TAC grants. So things like transportation, emergency grant aid, connecting people to childcare. And the current TACT program in Build Back Better does require 15% of grant funds to be set aside for those types of services. And we're excited to continue to work with, hopefully, the Department of Labor and the Department of Education to implement these programs, because we have a whole series of other recommendations for how these programs can be administered better. So a couple more details. The TACT program that will be at the Department of Labor, where it was under the Obama administration, will receive about $1 billion, $1.2 billion, which is about half of what the original TAC grants had. Still a huge amount of money to build community college capacity. And what's also interesting is they ask that the colleges competing for these grants demonstrate that they're serving underserved populations, which I think is a particularly interesting development for that program. And then the Community College Industry Partnership Grants is a bigger program. It's about $5 billion, so significantly bigger than the original TACT, over twice as big, obviously. And the legislation actually sets aside about $100 million for the Department of Education to administer the program, and also work with colleges that serve diverse populations to actually apply for the program, which we think is a really interesting innovation as well, and something we've recommended in our recommendations. And then the sort of allowable uses in the partnership grants are very similar to the TAC grants. I would say that the only difference would be maybe something more around like funding articulation agreements and things like that, but they have very similar allowable uses, which is interesting. And we are basically standing by to see what happens with the help committee language that hopefully will be coming out this week. It's supposed to come out, and to see what sort of survives that bird bath, the Senate rules around reconciliation that Amy alluded to as well.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Recently, my 7-year-old has been reintroduced, or I guess introduced for the first time to Annie, and for me, reintroduced. And I didn't realize that there's a scene where Annie's sunny attitude is credited for the New Deal. But I was thinking about that because I was curious if you had any thoughts about how the investments that are being made could be different from the after the Great Recession, and what could be done better if you were thinking about how these investments.
Yeah, so Mary Alice talked about how this circumstance is just way different from the Great Recession insofar as we don't have the slack labor market that we had there. So I think there's a couple of opportunities that the Department of Labor and the Department of Education should think about as they're implementing these programs. The first piece is really supporting community colleges around working with employers to improve job quality. We saw a lot of in the original TACT investment that a lot of the programs, it was all about high demand programs. So programs where employers needed more people and not necessarily around jobs that actually served the employees well or the people who are going into the labor market well. So we ended up with a lot of low-end healthcare programs and things like that. So rather than working to make sure that those care jobs, for instance, were better jobs for people while they supplied the sort of employees to the labor market, they just sort of supplied them and people got very bad jobs coming out of that. So I think in this iteration, the Department of Labor and the Department of Education should think about how to structure the grant program to support that particular piece better. And the other piece is to be more focused on equity. In the first round, the TAC grants, the people served did sort of mirror the demographics of the United States, although Latino were underrepresented in the work or in the program. But I think really this round, we should support colleges thinking more about how to support the populations who need us most and who have been the most underserved by our current system. So how do we plug those holes and build the capacity of the colleges to actually serve them better over time? So those would be two recommendations that I think the Department of Labor and the Department of Education should think about going forward.
Got it. Super helpful. I'd love to transition, into talking a little bit about the relationship between job quality and the kind of national conversation on care. And Lil, I would love if you'd be willing to talk to us a little bit about how things have shifted over the last 18 months and how Congress is investing in care work and workers.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think we could all agree that the pandemic has really shed light on just how essential care workers are. This includes early child care workers as well as healthcare workers. And Laura has already talked a little bit about how the Build Back Better Act would include a historic investment in a child care entitlement program that is partially focused on making sure that states are paying early child care workers a living wage. But there are also some significant investments in home care workers under the Build Back Better Act. And we know that home care workers, much like child care workers, are overwhelmingly female, people of color, and individuals who were not necessarily born in the United States. We see under the Build Back Better Act two specific investments in home care workers. One, we see that the Build Back Better Act incentivizes states to make improvements to their optional home and community-based services program under Medicaid, which is the primary source of funding for long-term care. Medicaid or Medicare also provides some funding for this, but most of the funding is through Medicaid. And Medicaid involves a federal state partnership. So under Build Back Better, the federal government would actually increase the amount of funding that they would allocate towards the FMAP, which is a federal medical assistance percentage, if states make some significant investments and improvements to their plans related to home and community-based care. So a 6% increase at the federal level would make more funding available to states if they increase the payment rates for home care workers and specifically increase the amount of wages for this population. And these rates are really what determine the compensation of much of the home care workforce. So this is a really important shift. It really builds on the 10% 1-year increase in FMAP under the American Rescue Plan. And we saw with that, short-term FMAP increase under the American Rescue Plan that at least 33 states have elected to increase the compensation rates for their home care workers. Many states went with a one-time short-term pay increase, and they even cited in their plans to the Department of Health and Human Services that the reason for the short-term increase was because of the short-term funding that was available under the American Rescue Plan. So the fact that BBB would provide a permanent increase in FMAP can really improve some of the conditions of this essential workforce. In addition to the FMAP increase, the Build Back Better Act would make $1 billion available through grant funds administered by the Department of Labor in coordination with Health and Human Services to advance strategies for improving the wages and training of home care workers. They specifically call out registered apprenticeships, and we know based on extensive research that registered apprenticeships are proven to improve employment as well as earnings outcomes of those who complete it. This is really important in the absence of federal increase in the minimum wage or a framework for improving the pay of home care workers. Many care workers have really struggled to make a living. We've seen, and we've actually published some research on some innovative approaches at the state level in Washington, in California, and Illinois, but some action at the federal level is much needed. So we're really encouraged to see some of the provisions for home care workers and care workers under the Build Back Better Act.
You talked a lot about apprenticeships in addition to obviously talking about the importance of care work and its how there's been a huge shift to focus on it. Can you tell us, as it relates to apprenticeships, what the Build Back Better Act means for the future of the investments in it mean for the future as you see it?
Absolutely. I know Mary Alice mentioned earlier that the apprenticeship investments in Build Back Better are kind of scattered throughout. We're really pleased to see the level of investment in apprenticeship because given the economic insecurity that COVID has brought on, apprenticeship is really taking on a greater importance as a strategy for building a healthy and inclusive economic recovery and to really support communities. So there's a dedicated $1 billion investment in registered apprenticeship programs, as well as pre-apprenticeship programs that map on to registered apprenticeship programs. Included in that, communities could use that funding to support youth apprenticeship, which we've done extensive work on as part of our partnership to advance youth apprenticeship. The bill specifically says that of that $1 billion, $500 million must go toward apprenticeship investments that support individuals with barriers to employment. This includes individuals with disabilities. And there's a real focus on non-traditional apprenticeship populations. So people who have been historically excluded from these opportunities that, again, we know from research tend to yield better employment and labor market outcomes. But that's not the only place that we see apprenticeship investments. The Build Back Better Act includes a $2 billion increase in the National Dislocated Worker Program. This provides discretionary funding to states and communities to help them deal with individuals who have been laid off from their jobs. And one of the strategies that's specifically called out in a permitted investment under dislocated worker grants is registered apprenticeship. There's another $1 billion for adult education and training programs. Again, registered apprenticeship is an allowable use of funds. And then, there are some historic investments in climate mitigation strategies. And so specifically, there's $1 billion for pre-apprenticeship programs that map onto registered apprenticeship programs in support of, that really help build the climate change workforce, another $450 million to create registered apprenticeship programs in climate-related non-traditional apprenticeship populations or occupations, excuse me, and another $350 million for pre-apprenticeships that map onto registered apprenticeship programs and really create access to climate-related programs for individuals that have traditionally face barriers to employment. There are also investments or, allowable funds to support cybersecurity apprenticeship programs. This is an area where we've really seen some innovation in recent years as the federal government has been increasing investments in apprenticeship programs. And so we're really pleased to see more investments under the Build Back Better Act.
Got it. Well, it's really great to see how these investments are being useful. I would love to ask you, Mary Alice, if there are specific ways you see the investments in community colleges, in worker protections, and in workforce development, specifically shaping the Selma's work over the next year.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, I as you can hear, we're from Iris and Lowell, we're already engaged in a lot of the areas and sort of programs and services and policies that are really directly impacted by Build Back Better. So we fully expect to remain very much engaged in sort of helping the administration implement these investments, and also again do the kind of case making and just sort of holding up for public awareness, what is happening, what the possibilities are. As you heard Lowell describe the ways in which care workers are going to could potentially receive, a wage bump. Home care workers could receive a wage bump. It's wonky stuff. It's there's a lot of detail in that. Our role is in part to sort of lift that up so that people can sort of understand it in plain language and then also seize those opportunities and make sure that they get the attention that they need. And again, to just keep the information flowing so that we can do, help the government and all of the many allies and partners that are working on this stay aligned, stay aware of what the possibilities are. Our youth apprenticeship, our partnership to advance youth apprenticeship will obviously we'll be using that to make sure that we get out the word around what are the possibilities around federal investments in youth apprenticeship and just also youth employment in general, because we work with those communities. So again, it's just raising up the possibilities and the opportunities. We'll be doing a lot of that, and we have extensive ongoing work with community colleges as well. So I'll leave the answers to that to Iris and Lowell, the details.
So I have a few questions that have come in from the audience, and I would like to start with one that I'm going to kind of meld with another question in hopes that it will address a few things at once. So the question is, how can federal policymakers better facilitate or fund partnerships between community colleges, community-based organizations, worker centers, and other training providers? And what I'd love to just add into that is just that there's kind of so much going on at once when you think of the policy element of this. What are the ways that maybe even business and philanthropy should approach their support to this as well? So I've kind of thrown in a few things at once. Let me know if I should repeat it. Is it a clear enough question?
I think so. Maybe if you could repeat, maybe just repeat the front end real quick.
Yes.
So.
How can federal policymakers better facilitate or fund partnerships between community colleges, community-based organizations, worker centers, and other training providers? And maybe I'll just leave the other one off, but it's just this idea of where do philanthropy and business play into their support as well?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And again, just really gets to what needs to be happening and how we need to be using these historic investments to strengthen these kinds of partnerships and bring in some kind of new partners, particularly community-based organizations, and worker centers are a great example of some folks who maybe institutions or groups that weren't at the table as much sometimes in workforce development conversations and need to be because they have a lot of value to add. I will say, I think the Build Back Better Act already creates those opportunities. We have one of the investments we didn't talk about is in sectoral partnerships. This is a major, I think it's, Iris, correct me if I'm wrong, or Lil, I think it's $10 billion in sectoral partnerships between our public workforce system, community-based organizations, things, community colleges. The whole purpose of that investment is to strengthen connections across these different parts, these different stakeholders in our public workforce system, including employers very much. And again, I would say, so I think they're there, that the tax investment also really can be a place to sort of help build partnerships and strengthen partnerships. For me, I think the role for philanthropy there is critically important, which is, again, to just support information sharing, information generation around what's happening, who should be at the table, new possibilities. And also sometimes the federal money, there's partners that need to be at the table that might not be there or might not be eligible. And again, sort of philanthropy can help step in to make sure that they are. And sometimes we always find that there's needs for funding for intermediaries. That's been a long-standing theme in the workforce development field, is intermediaries. The sectoral partnership program at the Department of Labor, that $10 billion program, is designed specifically to address, I think, that particular need to strengthen the intermediary that connects employers and colleges and the public workforce system and other agencies, but they'll definitely need help. But Lowell and Iris, what did I miss?
So one thing I'll just put a plug in here for is that, yes, the Department of Education has some money to work with colleges that don't have the capacity to fill out a really good application for these funds. And that's really the downfall of a lot of competitive grant programs, is that you end up funding colleges with the capacity to write really good grant applications. And I think a place for philanthropy is to find colleges that maybe don't have the capacity to write really good grant applications and help them get that capacity, so we can spread around some of this money to actually serve colleges that maybe need it more, and then help them build the capacity to be able to use the money and run the grant program.
There's another question that's near and dear to me, which is just this idea about the local element of it too. And Lo, please jump in on the previous question, but I did want to just throw out there this idea of what local foundations in local communities could do in terms of partnerships and thinking about what happens at the local level. So if you want to hit the previous one or that one.
Sure. I mean, I think it kind of addresses both questions. So, Mary Alice really spoke to the importance of systems alignment and making sure that different stakeholders are connected as they think through how to use this money. And I completely agree. I mean, given that the Build Back Better Act is a reconciliation bill, it means that it's increasing money for existing workforce and other programs. There are advantages to this. It makes it easier to get the money out. And in many cases, state and local leaders already have a plan for how to use their workforce dollars and who couldn't use more funding. But we've seen that our workforce system has not served everyone well. People of color, other marginalized communities. And so I think philanthropy and local leaders can play a really important role in making sure that the massive influx of federal funding that will be made available is going to be used in different ways and used to specifically target inequities and in access to these workforce programs. And I think that's where local partnerships are key. I think that there's a lot of room to bring together stakeholders that might know each other, but might not be engaged in long-term and strategic planning. And I think thinking about sustainability now is going to be really important because this is a massive investment. We don't know when we'll have another one, but to develop plans that really focus on systems alignment and long-term systems alignment now, I think we'll make sure that the people who depend on our public workforce system are better off.
Got it. So we are getting to a point where we should probably transition to the next panel. However, I'm going to throw a question in here that perhaps all of you in the ed policy place can, excuse me, not ed policy, I'm completely confusing myself. The workforce development could think a little bit about whether it's something that you could reply to in the chat. And so I just threw that in there if you have time. I also wanted to ask, maybe this is where I was going with the ed policy. The ed policy team, you mentioned some elements of work that you were doing already, like the Grow Your Own program and some of the other things. And so I would just ask that both your program as well as the workforce development related work program think a little bit about if there are certain things that you mentioned that you could put a link into the chat, that'd be great. Because I know myself, I was thinking, oh, I'd like to learn more about that. I'd like to know where I can find information on that. So if you can all throw those things into the chat, we will segue into a conversation on tech policy. And with that, I would love to ask my colleagues, Sarah and Josh, to introduce themselves, please. Sarah, will you start?
Sure. Thanks so much, Autumn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Morris. I'm the director of the Open Technology Institute. I've had a long tenure at OTI and New America. I'm just entering my 11th year early this spring. The broadband access and adoption work has always been a big part of my portfolio here, and happy to talk about some really big wins that we've seen in that space with you all today. Go ahead, Josh.
Hi, and I am Josh Steger. I am the Deputy Director for Broadband and Competition Policy at OTI, where I have been since 2014.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I would love to start with you, Josh, and ask a few questions related to the work that you've been doing and the major technology investments that have been made in the two COVID relief bills passed last December and March, and the recently passed infrastructure package, and how OTI's work has been related to these provisions.
Sure. Well, those three laws that you mentioned that Congress enacted over the last year have had some very significant tech investments, particularly on broadband access and adoption. Collectively, those three laws are the strongest action that Congress has ever taken to close the digital divide. The infrastructure law that was signed into law on November 15th included $65 billion for broadband infrastructure. But although that is a very significant investment, we call these laws the strongest action Congress has ever taken on this front, not just because of the dollar amount, but largely because of the holistic approach that Congress has taken to address the digital divide. Historically, we have worked a lot with Congress to expand their understanding of the digital divide, and they typically haven't addressed the full breadth of this problem. There's typically been a focus on access, and especially unserved rural communities that have no infrastructure for broadband, which is a very serious problem. But as OTI's research over the past 11 years has consistently demonstrated, the digital divide is caused by a variety of problems, not just access, but also affordability. In fact, most people that do not have internet access, it's because they can't afford it. And then secondly, it's a question of adoption and digital literacy. If they overcome the barriers to access and then affordability, there is still remaining problems where a significant number of people lack the digital literacy and the skills to use the internet and to understand why they should take it up. So the infrastructure law in particular addresses all three of these issues pretty significantly. In many, many ways. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't get into everything, but on the access side, there's $42 billion that will go to NTIA, which is a component of the Commerce Department, to close the access problems. There's also $14 billion to address affordability, to subsidize the high cost of broadband for low-income families. And then on the adoption piece, the bill also includes what's called the Digital Equity Act, which is something OTI has worked on for years, which creates a grant program to create state and local digital literacy programs to address that piece. So we've never really seen Congress do anything like this before, and really attack this problem from all different sides. And that is why we have been so supportive and so active with this law. Certainly, if $42 billion for access would be something that we would have, supported, but we're really celebrating these investments because of the many other pieces of this. In terms of OTI's role in this, so it's really a culmination of over a decade of our work. Many of the things that are in this law include things that OTI has been fighting for since our creation in 2009. First up, I'll just say it's about pricing transparency. The very first piece of public advocacy that OTI ever did in 2009 was calling for something called what we call a broadband nutrition label. This is a standardized format modeled after the FDA nutrition labels that people know that show on their food products. And this label is designed to show people what the cost of internet service is in very simple terms, so they know what they're paying for. Because our research has consistently found that consumers don't understand and struggle to figure out what the total cost of broadband is. They're typically rife with hidden fees, surprise bills, that sort of thing. And I think, when we first proposed this idea in 2009, we did not anticipate that it would be an 11-year fight, but it is in the bill, and the FCC now has to implement it. So that has been a particular win for us. Also, the bill requires the FCC to collect pricing data for the very first time on the cost of broadband. Also something that around pricing transparency that might seem like low-hanging fruit, but has faced a lot of opposition, particularly from the companies that charge these high prices and would like to continue to keep those costs hidden. Around the larger pieces of the bill, we really worked a lot in 2019 over the course of that year with what was then called the Rural Broadband Task Force to develop model language, which at the time we didn't know when it would be used, but we were just told, working with congressional allies in a working group, let's come up with the pie in the sky language, not what's politically realistic, just what do we need to close the digital divide. And we worked very actively with this congressional group throughout 2019. And when the pandemic hit in March 2020, we were able to hit the ground running because we had some of that model language ready to go. And that then spilled out into the December COVID relief bill, the American Rescue Plan, and this infrastructure law. So it included a lot of things that we fought for, including a big investment to address affordability. And this has been one of our biggest priorities over the past several years at OTI, is elevating the importance of broadband affordability. This is an issue that many in Congress were simply unwilling to talk about for many, many years. So we have published a series of what we call cost of connectivity reports, where we have we tried to uncrack the black box of broadband pricing, since the government doesn't collect this data, and have tried to collect the data ourselves, looking at hundreds of internet plans around the world, and finding that the US has some of the highest cost and slowest speeds compared globally. So the collective impact, I think, of these reports has been significant in finally getting Congress to realize that they have to address affordability, not just access. President Biden posted charts from our cost of connectivity studies earlier this year on social media. So that has been a long time coming. And in terms of the policy impact, I think that the biggest thing that we have seen is the creation of what was called the emergency broadband benefit earlier this year, what we are now calling the Affordable Connectivity Program. It is a multi-billion-dollar program that will provide, it's currently providing $50 a month to subsidize the cost of internet to eligible households. That will convert to $30 a month next year with some of the new funding that came in the infrastructure law. And that is something that we worked a lot on for the past several years. And particularly, as Amy mentioned earlier, around the eligibility categories. So we really worked to add Pell Grant recipients to make sure that that community is included in this program. And that was something that many policymakers, especially in the broadband space, they were not familiar with this community. There was historically a lot of work with the National School Lunch Program, with Medicaid, and with SNAP as being eligible for benefits programs like this, but getting Pell was a really significant win in helping focus on low-income college students who, also very much face very real problems in accessing the internet. There are quite a few other things in the bill that we've worked on, elevating the importance of tribal broadband investments that I think we can, talk about a bit more in this discussion, but hopefully that's a brief overview of some of the work that we've done in this legislation.
This is phenomenal. I feel like I've just in these few moments learned a lot about kind of like what's most important, what's at stake, as well as just the incredible amount of work that you guys have done and how it's really made quite a difference. Sarah, I wanted to ask you a little bit. So there's a lot to be excited about in terms of the investments in digital infrastructure and equity. But now there's this issue of making sure that these policies actually turn into reality. And as I understand it, there are some organizations like FCC and NTIA that will be responsible for implementing those policies. And I'd love to learn a little bit about, can you tell us a little bit about like what they should be, what they're doing, what's at stake, what we should be concerned about?
Yeah, thanks, Autumn. Yeah, so this is exciting. We have this really big infrastructure package that included a lot of our priorities, passed with bipartisan support earlier this fall. But now we really have to do, the work doesn't stop there. We have to really work to ensure that these programs, both at the NTIA and the FCC, are implemented in alignment with these broader policy priorities. I like to say that there's it took me a long time as an advocate in this space to sort of fully understand the different levers of influence and the ways that we can enact change. And I think, very early career, Sarah focused a lot on FCC comments and making policy recommendations and hoping they stuck. But I've learned over the years that there are tremendous opportunities to influence policy, both in terms of the policy itself, but also personnel and also money. And what we're seeing right now is kind of, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, both because of everything that happened across the Midwest this week, but all of those things are at play at once. And we have real opportunities to make serious headway across these agencies. So real briefly, just as by way of background, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is the independent agency tasked with promoting competition, protecting internet users in the telecommunications policy space. It includes phone, it includes broadcast cable, all of those things. And we've been adamant that the jurisdiction of the FCC should also include the internet as well. And there's some challenges that they're going to have to sort out in the coming months to get on the right footing there. And then the NTIA is an administration, it's an agency within the Department of Commerce, led by an administrator. I believe that they've had an acting administrator since 2019. Josh will correct me if I'm wrong. And both of these agencies are poised to sort of round out their top level leadership within coming days, perhaps coming weeks. On the FCC side, Chairwoman Rosenworcel was confirmed, was in her renomination to the FCC. We still have a fifth commissioner slot to make sure that that whole the whole agency, 5 commissioners, is fully seated. And longtime friend and ally of OTI, Gigi Sohn, has been nominated by the president for that 5th seat, and she is moving through that process a little slower than we'd like, but she is moving through. And then on the NTIA side, incidentally, former OTI director Alan Davidson is the president's nominee for that role, and he just tomorrow morning, today's Tuesday, tomorrow morning will hopefully be voted out of the Senate Commerce Committee and teed up for a floor vote. And depending on the vagaries of how long Congress stays in session, will hopefully be confirmed by the end of the year as administrator or shortly thereafter. So we're really excited, as Josh said, about the opportunities that these funds have the programs have created through the infrastructure package. Still some work to do to get the personnel in place, and then lots of work to do to work with these policymakers to make sure the programs are rolled out in ways that are protective and embody the types of policies we want to see in this space.
That's fantastic. It's interesting because all of these investments have been, in some ways, one might call them historic. But I'm curious also whether Josh or Sarah to answer this question of what's missing, and what do you believe is still necessary? And maybe that's a good plug for the element of hopefully Alan and others being able to kind of move some things forward. What's on your wish list?
We have a lot of wish list. There's a lot of work to do in just standing up so to put it in perspective, the Broadband Technologies Opportunities Program, which is called BTOP, which was the broadband connectivity program that was stood up as part of the 2008 federal stimulus package, that contained about $4.1 billion for broadband projects. The infrastructure bill that was passed earlier this year contains just for infrastructure projects alone, administered by NTIA, over $42 billion. So we're talking about orders of magnitude more capacity and more money, which just means there's a lot of work to be done to kind of stand up those programs. And I think, as someone who was OTI was a sub-grantee for the former BTOP programs, and as someone who's kind of having lived through those projects and the possibility that they created, I'm really excited to think about what we can do as supporters of communities who are about to receive this influx of support to build networks. And I think, in terms of needs, there's just a degree of coordination and connecting these incredible community level and state level projects with the broader ongoing federal policy agenda. And I think building some of the durable relationships between practitioners and community organizations on the ground with sort of access to both NTIA and other agencies that are administering these programs, but then also attempting to embody the policies that we want to see and how these programs are structured and how they're evaluated to make sure the lessons learned get translated into broader policy discourse. And I think that's what I get really excited about. There's a lot, it's hard work, and I think New America creates a really good platform for potentially approaching some of those problems in an on the ground and in DC sort of combined approach.
I have so many more questions I want to ask, and I see that we're getting closer to the time, so I will try to be a little faster. And maybe you can give me brief answers where you feel that works and not where it doesn't. So Sarah, OTI has done considerable work with platform companies on their algorithms, but has Congress made any investments in regulating or legislating on these algorithms? And if they haven't, how might they do that effectively?
Yeah, so this is a really challenging area. So I'll try to be very brief because we could do a whole panel on just what do we do about platform accountability and algorithms. The short answer is it's hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons. One, because we have the First Amendment, and so there's a degree to which Congress has to be careful about telling companies how they have to moderate speech online, and algorithms are an important component, for better or for worse, with how companies moderate content online or decide what content you see. And so that's hard. It's also hard because while it's undeniable that there are large companies in the internet ecosystem that wield tremendous influence and present very real problems for the internet ecosystem and for internet users, there's a lot of different actors in this space, and making big decisions can have consequences for a large number of constituencies, actors online. So Congress hasn't, there are various bills sort of out in the ether around transparency for algorithms. There's been bills that have been introduced to modify a very wonky part of the Communications Act, Section 230. Nothing has really surfaced to the top. There's also digital privacy laws, conversations that are happening, and that would have an impact on how some of these major tech companies navigate digital spaces and some of these algorithmic fairness and accountability questions. But the hard work is approaching this in a multifaceted way, and OTI is very well equipped to do that because we have expertise in the competition and antitrust space. We have privacy expertise. We have algorithmic accountability and content moderation expertise. And there's a lot at play, and we're bringing to bear all of those resources as we think through the best ways to solve some of these problems online.
Got it. So I'm also curious about a report that I believe is coming out tomorrow, and it is on the Schrems 2 decision. Can you tell us a little bit about the implications of this decision for U.S. policymakers as they think about data governance?
Happy to. Yeah, happy to. So this has been a big project that we have been working on over the past year. In July of 2020, the Court of Justice in the European Union invalidated the European Commission's framework that was laid out in the Schrems 2 case. So the whole issue here is the idea that the internet is global. It doesn't necessarily, there aren't country by country boundaries in all cases. I mean, there are some practical boundaries, but information has to, by design, flow across the entirety of the internet. And so the Schrems 2 decision dealt with the way that these cross-border data transfers were structured. And when you're thinking about what you want in a policy around data transfers, you want to make sure that the companies between which the information is flowing have adequate safeguards in place to protect that data. And so what the court did in 2020 was say, sorry, this agreement that you all worked out, it's not actually working here because the US's surveillance policies are inadequate to protect internet users and the flow of data. So what we did at OTI was spend the past year convening stakeholders. We did a major convening last spring and put out a report with very US-centered policy recommendations. We did another convening this summer And the report coming out tomorrow is a combined set of transatlantic recommendations between the EU and what the EU and the United States can both be doing to further some of the recommendations that we made in the earlier US focused report. The takeaways are we need to improve US surveillance laws so that they include adequate safeguards for user privacy and security. And we also recommend we will recommend a number of other approaches that we can take to ensure that we're able to get to a place where we can reestablish better cross-border data transfer agreements.
Got it. So my last question, and I'd love for Josh, for you to share your thoughts on this, and then Sarah, for you to as well after. What would you say to funders and companies who are interested in making sure that these infrastructure investments actually have the impact they're intended to? What would you tell them to do?
Well, I would say, I mean, from the immediate short term, to make sure that these investments work, there is an incredible amount of implementation work that we have to do at the FCC and NTIA. The bills leave a lot of the details up to those agencies. And as we have seen in past efforts to close the digital divide at these agencies, the money can actually go the wrong way. And so in order to make sure that this happens, though, right now, the most immediate problem is that we have a deadlock at the FCC and we do not have a Senate confirmed leader at NTIA. So in the immediate short term, if anyone has relationships in the Senate, please tell them to confirm Alan Davidson and Gigi Sohn immediately. It really is a very real problem for anyone who cares about implementing these bills. But hopefully we'll get through that in the next few weeks or months. And when that's done, there is a lot of work to be done throughout 2022 and 2023 around these issues to make sure that, for example, community and municipal networks are really elevated here. That's one big thing that we didn't get in these bills was some specific language that prioritizes local networks. Now, not having that language in the law doesn't mean that it's over. We get another bite at the apple where, in particular, NTIA can create rules that still prioritize those networks. And we've done research for many years showing how many local networks provide better, cheaper service that's closer to the consumer in many cases than some of the big ISPs. So elevating the importance of those kind of networks and empowering localities to be able to access this funding is going to be one of the big challenges in the next year.
Thank you. And Sarah?
I think Josh is exactly right. I think too, something that I'm always thinking about is how do we ensure that we're evaluating this work well? And I think that there's some really interesting opportunities for New America to do some cross-programmatic work here. I mean, on the Affordable Connectivity Program side, it's a benefits program that's going to have some rocky implementation, inevitably going to have some rocky implementation issues and challenges, particularly in terms of making sure that money is reaching the constituencies that it was designed to serve. And the FCC will play a really significant role in administering and also reevaluating that program over time. So making sure that we're collecting good data, using it smartly, and bringing expert analysis from whether it's New America or elsewhere to make sure that we have mechanisms for evaluating what worked and what didn't. And I think that's an area we sometimes forget about, the evaluation component, because we're so excited about the policy wins and getting the program stood up. But there's also really good opportunities for lessons learned. Similarly, on the NTIA side, we have communities across the country that are poised to become laboratories of ideas for how to successfully connect the unconnected or the underconnected. And we should be learning from those lessons. I think we often get stuck in this is what the policy should be kind of at the macro federal level. But we still have a lot to learn. And there's a lot of, communities are different. They have different needs. They have different obstacles, whether they're geographic, demographic, et cetera. And I'm really personally excited to see the different approaches that these communities take in getting their folks online. But I want to make sure that we're capturing those stories and those and that rich data, so that going down the road, we have, you know, hopefully like a 50-state playbook for how to do broadband delivery and continue to improve over the next 5-10 years.
Thank you so much. This has been a really engaging and timely conversation. Thank you. Just a heartfelt thank you to my colleagues and to all of you who have taken the time. Our apologies for going a few minutes over, but I think this was just such a great conversation on issues that are incredibly important and things that are really on the kind of cutting edge as it relates to what's happening in 2022 and going forward. Thanks again to all of our participants and to our panelists, and wishing all of you a good holiday season. Thank you.